So I was reading an article recently on the unity.org website, and it's all about the desires that we can sometimes have to change other people. And it opened with this short story. The Sufis tell the story of a man who in his youth wanted to change the world. He was passionate and he prayed every day to be successful. But he made no progress. As the years went by and he approached middle age, he changed his prayer. Rather than praying to change the world, he decided to narrow his circle. His daily prayer became, God, I haven't been successful at changing the world, so please help me at least be able to change the people I live with, the people that I see each and every day. Still, he failed. As he approached old age, he changed his prayer one last time. This time his prayer became, God, I haven't been successful in changing the world, and I haven't even been successful at changing the people I live with. Let me change myself. And of course, with that as his prayer, he was successful. I think that story exposes the T's in the title for today's lesson of how to change others. See, it's really not about us and any ability we think we may have to change others. It's about the potential for others changing that can get ignited in them as a result of the changes we make within ourselves. We'll get to all that in a few minutes, but first I just wanted to do a real simple check-in by asking a very simple question. Who are you trying to change? Who are you trying to change? The unnamed author of the article I was reading put it another way. I love this one. Who's your project? Who's your project? You know, maybe your answers are nobody. And maybe the questions would be more applicable if I phrased them, who have you tried to change? Or who was your project? Because I think most of us have probably been in that space of knowing what is good and best for someone else and trying our best to get them to change into that. You know, maybe it was a judgmental in-law, you know, or a critical coworker, maybe a non-communicative, you know, spouse or a partner, or maybe it was an unfriendly neighbor. And we likely held some very understandable, some even common reasons why we wanted to affect those changes. You know, it's because we love them so much. You know, or we just knew deep down that if they meditated more, they'd be better off. Or we just knew that if they simply, just changed their diet or their exercise habits, they'd be so much happier. And while all of these reasons could very well be true, they're also justifications to our answer of why we want someone to change. And the course that we're invited to take today is one where we stay with the question. We don't start going into meditation and diets in this area. We stay with the question, who are we trying to change? Who's our project? And here's why. And this is likely not news to anybody. We've all probably either heard it before or we've learned it through experience. We sit with the questions long enough to remember that people don't change because we want them to. They change because they want to. We remember that it doesn't matter how skilled we are or how noble our intentions or even how manipulative we might be able to be. People do not make lasting changes until they are willing and ready to do so. And that more often than not, when we remove ourselves from the picture or just reduce the pressure that we may have been exerting, any temporary change that could very well have occurred will cease. And the person will very often revert back to the way he or she had been before. Does that mean we're helpless? Does that mean that we can't offer our help and support to others for change? Well, no, of course it doesn't. However, it means that it will only work when the time is right. And the right time can come about in any number of ways, and I'm just going to offer two. The first one is when someone asks for help. When someone reaches out and they shares their desire, their prayer request, their struggle, when someone seeks out our opinion and perspective. In other words, it's when another person has come to a point in their own lives when they are willing to look for different ways of being and realize that they need some help in order to do so. That is a space where your wisdom and your life experience, it is welcomed, it is more easily received, it is so appreciated. The second way is what I mentioned just a minute or two ago. And it's the one where we ignite that willingness for change in another through the work we do within ourselves. Longtime, well-known Unity minister Eric Butterworth wrote about this in his book, Celebrate Yourself. And he referred to it under an umbrella phrase of be an influence. And I found that to feel similar, at least for myself, to the words that were in that song we heard just before the lesson started, that verse of lyrics that said, I'll remember for you. Right? I'll remember for you. Be an influence. And when we think of an influencer in today's world, while not exclusively, it is often used in reference to social media marketing. And I found this following definition of a social media influencer. It's someone who has the power to affect the purchasing decisions of others because of his or her authority, knowledge, position, or relationship with his or her audience with whom he or she actively engages. Let's put that into our context today. The power that we have access to, the wellspring of knowledge that we can call upon that can help us be those positive influences and catalysts for change for those with whom we interact in our relationships is, of course, God. The Spirit's presence in us. Thus, to become an influencer, as we're speaking of it today, the work begins within. And Butterworth made a very significant statement as to why this is so. He wrote, all of the persons about whom you are concerned, no matter how much you love or hate them, exist as far as you're concerned in your mind, your prejudices, your concerns. Though it is certainly possible to be an influence for good in bringing about great changes, the process involves something you do within yourself. And he went on to further expand upon that by offering a few ways that we can step into this role of being an influencer. And the first, we grounded our entire service in this. The first is to pray about the person. Pray about the person. And the first thing Butterworth asks us to consider in this regard, in his view, is that much that passes as prayer for a person is little more than concentrated worry about him. Take that in. Much that passes as prayer for another person is little more than concentrated worry about him or her. And that may sound a bit harsh or rough around the edges, but my experience of reading Eric Butterworth's books is that he typically writes in a very straightforward manner, especially when expressing his own opinion. But in this case, I do think there's a real big truth in his words about prayers for others. And it became clear to me as I began transitioning into seminary training and then into ministry after that, because it was in seminary that more than once, trust me, more than once, it was repeated that we, as future ministers, we needed to learn how not to carry the burdens of our congregants on our own shoulders. That when we conversed, listened, counseled, prayed with anyone, It was important that we individually would take the time after those interactions were complete to release the prayers, to release the person, to remember that each of us has our own journey to walk, and while we can always be present and offer our support, we could never walk another person's path in addition to our own. That release is sometimes a lot harder to accomplish if our thoughts, if even our feelings, our emotions, and especially if our words of prayer are filled with concern. So let's look at how this would outpicture in the process of becoming an influence. So we're focusing on ourselves, right? We're focusing on ourselves. And so when we pray for ourselves, what are we doing? When we pray for ourselves, we are lifting our consciousness from one level to another. We can't do that for someone else's consciousness, no matter how concerned we may be about them. But our concern is where we start with them. Because when we rise in consciousness ourselves, we rise above concern. It's no longer there. And when we do that within ourselves, then we are so open and able to just send them a prayerful whisper of namaste. You know, the Christ presence in us connecting, honoring, relating with the Christ presence in that person. It's from that consciousness in us that we can then affirm for them manifestations of whatever they have requested. Peace, prosperity, possibility, healing, wholeness, and no matter the circumstances, no matter the outside concerns. And how long do we pray for somebody else? Eric's answer was pretty simple, and again to the point. We pray for someone else as long as we feel concerned. When we feel a release, when we feel at peace, then our work is done. Our work is done. The second way that we can be an influencer is a little bit of a mouthful in terms of how we don't necessarily talk today. But Eric Butterworth says, establish yourself in the conviction of the divinity of man. Now, how many times have you said that in the grocery line? Establish yourself in the conviction of the divinity of man. And I'm so glad that Eric also put it into half as many words and in much more, common day, current vernacular. Practice believing in people. Practice believing in people. So let's pause for a moment here to recognize how prevalent it is and has been for a while now in our society today to generalize and or place limits upon other people or other groups of people. For example, just think about what we can hear, what we can read about older white men, conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats, white male police officers, black athletes, female executives, evangelicals, New Age practitioners. So many times what I hear and what I read is offered with the word all. All. You can fill in whatever person or group you want there. All feel this way or think that way. All can't be trusted. All are crooks. All are liars. That level of consciousness is one that can only sow division and separation and continual conflict. And besides that, it is likely very often that the words all and never, they're rarely 100% accurate in their use, right? So a better course would be to look for the good in people, the good things that people do, and let's generalize them instead. And let's generalize them based on the divinity within each of us. Let's generalize them based on the inherent good within each of us. How different would your own energy feel when you compare a statement like, all of them are dishonest, with, aren't people wonderful? When we think about the people in our lives who, just like us, make individual mistakes, one of the most effective and most influential things we can do is believe in them. Let them know we believe in them and why we believe in them. I can remember a day as clear as if it was yesterday, back to 1987. I was working as an assistant in an insurance company in Houston, Texas. And I just begun taking courses that would lead to the highest designation available within the insurance and risk management industry, at least at that time. And Clark was one of my instructors. He was an instructor of one of the 10 required courses. And about 2 weeks after completing the 10 weeks of that class, Clark calls me out of the blue. I didn't even know he had my phone number. I didn't know him. I just showed up for class for 10 weeks. And at the time, he was the assistant risk manager at a multi-billion-dollar worldwide corporation whose corporate office was headquartered in town. And he asked me on the phone if I would be interested in talking to him about a senior analyst position that had opened up in his department. Now I'm sitting there on the phone, I'm an admin assistant. I hadn't been looking for work. I didn't know this guy from Adam beyond him being a teacher. I didn't send a resume, and he's calling me to talk about a senior analyst position. And so what the heck, I accepted the interview. And aside from all the technical, industry-related things we talked about, he offered something to me that I felt was more important, obviously lasting, because I'm talking about it 34 years later, and absolutely life-changing for me. And I remember he did not know where I worked or what I did. He had my phone number. He knew I was in insurance, obviously, because I was in the course curriculum. But what he told me is what he had seen in me during the class. He told me what had impressed him about me, much of which had nothing to do with risk management. He told me the reasons why, beyond actual work experience, which I did not have, but why he believed that I could do the work that was being offered. And I was hired. But I was hired after Clark convinced a couple of layers of powers that be that they needed to disregard various requirements that were included on the corporate job description for that position. And that was the beginning of a 20+ year in that industry in which I was able to continue learning, continue growing and advancing in position because Clark had planted a seed in me that day that would start to grow and help me start believing in myself. From this place of belief in people, our influence continues as we can then find it so much easier to bless them. And we should follow through on that and actually extend those blessings. When we meet people, when we greet people, when we talk to people, write to people, or email them, text them, let it all come through that namaste consciousness. Let it come from the best of who you are and touch the best of who they are. And I failed miserably at this just the other day. Miserably. I mean, why sometimes ministers offer the lessons they offer because they gotta learn it for themselves. I was driving along 5 miles, as I'm going here, to the church. And down on Holiday Road, a truck pulled in behind me, and in my opinion, was driving in a fairly aggressive manner. And so when I reached our entry drive, I signaled. I began making my turn into the drive off the road here, and that gentleman became as one with his horn and offered me an opus with it like you would not believe. I did not offer him anything close to namaste. I didn't do anything. But I was sure thinking some things. Now meeting a person at whatever level of consciousness they may be, that's good. That's good. However, it doesn't mean that we respond back from that same level. We can always choose a higher road. We can always choose to bless them. Otherwise, we remain in conflict. And the conflict for me, because he drove off happy as can be on his way, I assume, but the conflict for me was the amount of time it took me throughout the rest of that day to shake off the misstep that I had made, and just that overall experience itself. A much better way that I could have responded in that moment would have been to just follow Jesus' teachings about turn the other cheek. And all that means is to remember that I cannot control the actions or the behaviors of anybody else, but I can regulate what I choose to react to in a negative fashion. I can control that. It is a discipline that we can practice and strengthen. It's a discipline to turn more quickly to that higher level of perception and consciousness, and to respond from that place, even if it's only in our own thoughts and completely unknown to someone else. But when we can do this, and we're actually in the presence of another person, gosh, it can serve to call that person higher too. It can be that catalyst for change that opens to them in such ways that their behavior becomes kinder, friendlier, maybe even a little bit loving. I've seen these next words a gazillion times, and I've yet to see a name attributed to them, and I imagine you've seen them as well. We cannot force someone to hear a message that they're not ready to receive, but we must never underestimate the power of planting a seed. We can't force anybody else to hear something they're not ready to take in. That doesn't mean we still can't plant a seed. See, planting a seed, that aligns quite well with the fourth and final way that Eric Butterworth felt that we could become an influence in someone else's life for change. He said that as we consider change, to act as if it's already taken place. Now, granted, he wrote specifically about the change we wanted to see in another person, but I think we can apply the concept to more than that. See, last week, I planted a seed of change right here when I announced my resignation and departure from this community at the end of this month. Now, that's an obvious change in and of itself. If for nothing else, it's just a change in personnel. There are bound to be more changes ahead. Some that you want to make. Some that will appear on their own, perhaps welcome, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps a combination of both. And right now, you may not know what all of that looks like, but that doesn't mean you can't see it in terms of it manifesting and coming forth from a consciousness of prayer. A consciousness of listening to each other and believing in one another. A consciousness of affirming the good in all and blessing each person no matter where they may be in that moment, and turning the other cheek whenever the opportunity presents itself. See, that's how you manifest the highest and the best for yourself, then for others, ultimately for the church. And just like my friend Clark believed in me, I sure as heck believe in you. God bless you.